What we want to talk about is the next level and advanced memory hacks. And a lot of this stuff is really, really interesting. And maybe it's something you want to save for another day or to use as part of the drills that I was talking about in the last session, and really push yourself to the next levels and to see what's possible. Some of these things are a little on the conceptual side. Some are impossible to test because they involve basically exponential numbers. But nonetheless, they can be a great challenge to use as exercises and also in terms of application. And some of the things we're going to talk about solve that problem of what to do if you don't have enough memory palaces, such as you've been sent to isolation in a prison and you only have that one room. And which never really happens to people who use memory techniques, I'm sure, because we're all very ethical and good citizens that don't go to prisons. But nonetheless, let's get started. There's several topics I want to cover: memorizing in real time, virtual memory palaces, and telesynoptic memory palaces. And I want to start with virtual memory palaces. Actually, we can break this down into several subsections. We can think of virtual memory palace elements inside of real memory palaces. We can think about virtual memory palace elements inside of not real memory palaces or virtual memory palaces. We can think about TVs and movies and video games and how to turn them into memory palaces. We can think about actually having completely fantasy memory palaces and what's involved in all of that. So one of the first things to cover is the virtual memory palace. And I can see that we're missing some notes that I put on, but we'll try and work with this as it is. A memory palace, a virtual memory palace element is something that doesn't exist that we place inside of a memory palace in order to store more information. And one of the typical things that you can do that's very, very easy is to insert a memory a bookcase that doesn't exist into a memory palace. So what you're seeing here, I tried to play with the images that I can use on my technology to make this sort of late 80s, early 90s sci-fi-esque bookcase here that is showing on the screen, and inserted it into this visual room that I'm in. And it is not really there, but by imagining that it's there, it can be used to store information. And if you can imagine, we can use the whiteboard now because the notations aren't showing up. If you can imagine that you have is this showing up from this angle, or should I try it from the other way? Okay. So if you can imagine having a bookcase inside of a real memory palace for the moment, and it's got 3 shelves: the top shelf, the middle shelf, and the bottom shelf. You can actually think of it as having 4 shelves. And you're approaching it strategically. So we visited this memory palace before. We had the bookcase, the bed, the desk, the chair. We had the wall, and the bike was a station in the memory palace as well. Let's say that the bike isn't there. We have an imaginary bookcase. That bookcase doesn't exist. It's just something that has been invented. So this is the bookcase. And what we need to do in order to maximize the effect of this bookcase so that we are able to use it effectively to store information is to follow all the same rules by identifying stations on it and by following those stations in a linear fashion that doesn't cross our own path or trap ourselves somehow. So let's imagine that we're coming at it in this direction. To be linear, we want to think about this. So we can move from the bottom to the top of the bookshelf. We can move from the top to the bottom of the bookshelf. We can start here and go down, or we can start here and go up. We can use the very top of the bookshelf. Let's just make this a little bit 3D here. This is not working, so we try this one. We can go like that. And we could even use these areas as stations if we want to. This I have never actually tried, this sort of side station, but it's actually a potential station as the case may be. Now, so then we need to decide how many stations do we want to make from this virtual memory palace element, this imaginary bookcase. We could have 1, 2, 3, 4. We could have just 1, 2, 3, or what I like to do to maximize my real estate, is to try and get as many as possible, but still being realistic, still giving space for things and not over cramming it, and have 3 per level. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And the reason why we're going backwards and then forwards and like this is that we are following this sort of linear passage. And we need to think strategically. There's a bit of an error here because we're going to end up crossing our own path at some level if we go that way. So in this case, it may not be that good to start at this top shelf and actually start here so that we can go this way and carry on our path. This is all sort of stuff that you do in the preparation stage, so you're not sort of thinking it out on the fly and going, what's the best way that this is going to work? So I had the numbers out there before, but this is a drawing that we've come up with. And that's basically how that works, is setting yourself up to use a virtual memory palace element and maximizing space. And then you can play the numbers and say, well, I really need 100 stations inside of this room, so I would need 10 bookcases with 10 stations per bookcase, and work with that. You're going to need to do exercise and really train to be able to use that effectively, but it's possible. It's a potential use, a maximization of space, and start simple. Just 1, 2, 3, 4 stations. Use the entire shelf of the bookcase, and then proceed to having 1, 2 by using the outer edge, the middle, or the inner edge, or whichever edge that you want to sort of name these things, and just practice and be strategic about it, starting simple and then build up more. Oh, there's my notes that I wanted to show. So this is showing the correct progression of moving from 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8, 9, so that we're still following this sort of linear path. And that's basically how things work with virtual memory palaces, is creating virtual memory palace elements like a bookcase. It's creating it and then strategically laying out the material so that you know what stations are available to you, numbering them, and then beginning to place your information there. So that's a virtual memory palace element, in this case a bookcase. Other virtual memory palace elements could be another bed, another couch, another door perhaps that's leading to something else. And really it's totally up to you, the kinds of things that you experiment with, but bookcases are classically usable because of how that they are designed to hold things. They're shelving for things in real life, so you can shelve associative imagery on them as well. Now, another thing that you can think about is TV shows and movies. And some people are really, really familiar, for instance, with things like The Simpsons home, and even all of the city in which that The Simpsons takes place, Springfield, right? And so you can imagine using parts of that city in order to create memory palaces and to create journeys and really find a lot of places. So if you live in the forest or are in prison and you can't find places, you could start studying TV shows and movies. And, of course you want to pick ones that are well structured, that have a logical progression, and still follow these rules of following your own path, not crossing your own path and not trapping yourself. I don't get into this kind of stuff except for there's very limited uses. I use sometimes Lost Highway by David Lynch because there's a very well-structured house that's very clear in my mind how that house works, and it's for a very limited number of stations. But more experiments, I want to get more into this and experiment more with larger spaces, larger buildings from movies, and larger cities even. And one thing that is also possible is to use an imagined place or a place from a movie and connect it with actual memory palaces. So you could move from a real memory palace to a memory palace based out of a TV show or a movie, and then back into a real one. This is all experimental territory, but things that you can use, because you should never let yourself get slowed down. Now, the question about video games came up before, and The kinds of video games that I've experimented with are the games from my youth, which are platform games. And platform games are called platform games because they involve a lot of platforms. And this is a classic example. And just for thrills and for fun, I've actually used a pretty unusual version of Donkey Kong, which is that it's Mario being rescued by the princess instead of the other way around for fun. But you'll notice also that I've structured the platform with numbered stations. And you, again, the way you would with a bookcase is you want to organize a linear journey so you're not crossing your own path and you're not really trapping yourself anywhere. Of course, the fireballs are a trap, but they wouldn't be part of your memory palace unless you were using them to create associative imagery. But again, moving from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and up to 20. And that's a lot of places to use to memorize just on a game. You could start with level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and so forth. And you don't necessarily need to have the variations in those different levels. You could actually just have level 1 repeated again and again and use it again. This is going to require more mental management, and it doesn't have the benefit of being a real place, but it is a place that you may be deeply familiar with if you've played Donkey Kong for any amount of time. Something like Pac-Man would not really work all that well, although you do have 4 corners and you have a center if you wanted to use those as memory palaces. Then there are first-person shooter games, which a lot of people use as memory palaces. I've not, because I just don't manage mental space that well. I've never been to them. I can't see the whole space comprehensively the way that I can a Donkey Kong screen or other platform games. They're just too wide and expansive, and part of those games are really the effect is that you can't really memorize the things that well, or rather memorize journeys that well, or rather better said is that the way that the layout is, the restriction of the first-person vision is meant to be a challenge. It's meant to be a fun and exciting barrier that you have to go look and, oh, where am I, and that sort of thing. You're discovering it as you go along. Of course, you develop memory of what that journey is, but for myself, I've never used them, but people do use them and quite successfully, and they have a lot of fun as well because they have a personal association to the game and they have enjoyed it. So that's an option in terms of using video games. Then there are elaborate worlds that are really a lot bigger than we saw Donkey Kong, and then the last image was Doom. Now there are things like Skyrim that are involving multiple areas that require maps, and they have oceans or the Sea of Ghosts and so forth. And a lot of people I know have contacted me, and Skyrim is a very popular memory palace generating game that you can use to get a lot of memory palaces and stations. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure exactly how that they're exploiting this and how they're using it, because this is not my realm of gaming, and I just don't game that much. But it sounds very fascinating, and I do hope to use it. But when I look at an image like this from a game like Skyrim, and I just think, it just seems like outdoor locations, as I showed you before, that are so unstructured, I can't really imagine how I would select which station would be which and how I would build a memory about it. But that partly has to do with that I don't play these games. But I can take it on anecdotal evidence from many people. I'm talking about dozens of people, and just it works for them. So that's really incredible and amazing that they're able to do that. So by all means, if you're a gamer, experiment with that. You can certainly have a lot of fun while you're doing it, and you're again using something that's interesting to you and that you're passionate about, and you're leveraging its power in order to make gains towards your goals. Now, there's something that I have worked with that I just call the train technique, because I imagine it as being a sort of train. And it's not the greatest, but it's good for poetry because of the strict linear journey. Basically, how the train technique works is that you have as I've structured here, you have a series of squares. So you're going to start at the first square and you're going to enter it, and you're going to use the four corners. And if you are comfortable doing it, you can use the center. But you want to, if you have a square like this, and we're thinking about it as being a train, well, every train has a sort of carriage at the back and a carriage at the front that links it to the next train. So you can actually use this as a station, and then here's where things get goofy and why that crossing your own path is not really that useful. Because if you come here and then that's a station, and then that's a station, and that's a station, and that's a station, how are you going to obey the economy of means in order to not start getting yourself crossed over, especially if you want to use that center? The most effective thing to do would really be to go from here to here to here, even though you're crossing your path there, then to here, and then to here, so you're losing these two spaces. But nonetheless, I've experimented with it, and I've gotten quite deep into poems like Paradise Lost and things from Blake. But it's worth experimenting with. It's a great drill. It's a great exercise to see the limits of how your mind works, and you may have more success with it than I have. But I mention it because it's something that I've done and really had a lot of fun with. But there is this problem of how to maximize the space when you're having to cross, and you have to think about it and go back and so forth. So I think maybe this helps illustrate just how important that can be to have a linear journey without crossing your own path. But the idea then is once you've exhausted all these stations, you then go to the next car, and that's car number 2. And then you go to the next one and the next one. And yeah, if you set in advance how many cars that you're going to use, like you decide something like a Blake poem or a poem by Shelley or Keats needs to be 20 train cars or 20 boxes and so forth, then you can do it, and you can leverage this sort of spatial journey knowing that you're really not linking it with familiar territory, you're linking it with conceptual territory. So if you wanted to go to a middle line, you don't really have any cues about where that middle line might be because it's just box 5, right? You could change the colors of the boxes, maybe have some sort of scheme like that, but something to experiment with, something that's a lot of fun to play with, and I've enjoyed it a great deal, but ultimately I've abandoned it because I haven't really found a particular use for it because of the lack of concrete stickiness that comes from real locations and real stations inside of those locations. Now, fantasy buildings are, unlike this, which is just sort of an abstract structure based on shapes, fantasy buildings are actual elaborate buildings that you create from scratch. So you would just say, I'm going to have an apartment. The apartment is going to have a lobby, and then it's going to have an elevator. The elevator is going to go to the second floor. The second floor will have 5 apartments, and those 5 doors will serve as stations, or you'll go into the individual apartments and so forth. And some people just love doing this. They have so much fun with it, and it works really great for them. Myself, I've never had much success with it because it's so much to manage. You have to think about what comes next, and you have to actually create it before you can think about what comes next. And so what's happening is that you're going along the journey, and you're thinking about what you wanted to recall, that you deliberately memorized, the associative imagery that you came up with to lay along the different stations, and you have to also reconstruct the memory palace as you go along, which if you're using memory palaces based on real locations and you're familiar with them enough and you've strategically laid out your map so that you follow the journey naturally, you don't have to rebuild the memory palace as you go along. You just simply go along. But fantasy buildings always seem to require a number of processes. I received a very, very interesting email the other day from someone who said I shouldn't be discouraging people from doing this. And I don't really. I just encourage them to use real locations. But he said that this works so fantastically for him, and he loves it so much that he thinks I should promote it more. I'm just describing it now, but I'm not really necessarily promoting it because I really want to promote things that are really going to work a lot better for the vast majority of people, which are the people who really can benefit from this the most, but often find this experimental, overly imaginary stuff just too much. They really want to just get into practical value. But I love this stuff too. I love conceptualizing and I love experimenting. And so far, personally, I've not had that much success with fantasy buildings for the reasons that I've cited, of having to reconstruct things while I want to focus on what exactly it is that I'm trying to recall. Now, this bridges the idea of a grand central station technique. And this is sort of one of the most classical images of the memory palace, which is the idea that you have a central place that you enter, and it has all kinds of doors that go to other memory palaces. So if you were to walk into a library, let's say, and the library has 100 doors, every single one of those doors would open onto another memory palace, and it could be another imaginary memory palace or a virtual memory palace or the Homer Simpson's house, or it could be your home. But the idea is that they gather them all together in a grand central station. And again, there are people who really love this and they use it. It's sort of a Renaissance Baroque kind of thing that was popular in those eras, really complicated in some sense, but it's elegant for other people. And that's really the idea, is that you enter there first, and that's where your things are organized. My solution to all this is to use the alphabet as much as possible, because the alphabet is not really a grand central station, but it is a way of organizing the memory palaces in a linear way that is flexibly traveled in different directions and just go to something. So I've associated something with D, and I know that it's D because of how I've structured it, because it's connected to Gilles Deleuze, and that's where my information is. And the name of the D Palace is Don's house. So I'm capitalizing on this alliteration, so to speak, of D, D, and D. And this creates the power that the mind goes there instantly. So the alphabet is its own chain, and the letter of the alphabet magnetizes what's in there to the person that it's associated with, to the subject that it's associated with, and I go there. Whereas the grand central station technique is kind of this idea that you have a central place, and then there's these doors that lead to different places. I guess you could have alphabetization in there as well, long hallways and so forth, but I like the keychain sort of idea of an alphabet is its own key on a chain of other alphabets. And something to be explored, certainly. But this is not anything that I built for myself, but people do love it. And Hannibal Lecter, of course, has this kind of memory palace, this sort of central station that he goes into. It's never really totally vividly described, but that's how I kind of think of what he's doing when we read that in the novels about Hannibal Lecter. Now, moving on, I want to talk about telesynoptic memory palaces, and this, I think, is really the most exciting type of memory palace of all, because it's not virtual. It's based on they are based on real locations that you then extend. So I use the word tele because of that sense of extending like a telescope, or the idea of being able to compress it back. So a telescope can be both extended and collapsed and still have that basic form. And synoptic means really gathering together similar items for study or for interpretation. So the synoptic gospels, for instance, in the Bible are called the synoptic gospels because they're essentially 4 versions of the same story. But they're very different, right? So different things happen to them or different things happen in the stories even though they're essentially the same story. So they're called the synoptic gospels because of that reason. We can see the differences even though they're the same. And so telesynoptic is bringing this together, and I want to explain how that works. Basically what you're doing is you're taking a real memory palace and then you're adding a feature to it. So you have a memory palace, let's say the one that we've been using of the room where my office is in the apartment where my office is, and we had that room, you see me sitting at the desk in that picture. Well, that's just the real memory palace. But if we wanted to reuse it again, we could make it black, we could make it blue, we could make it green, we could make it red, and we could also make it made out of grass. We could make it made out of stone, wood, paper, all kinds of different materials. We could make it made out of gas. We could make it made out of water. We could make it made out of blood. We could make it made out of saliva. I mean, all kinds of different versions of itself we could even use playing cards. And I'll get into this in a little bit of detail in a moment. But the whole principle here is you're adding a feature to distinguish the same thing from itself, so to speak, so that you create another version that's fresh and can be repopulated. So if you have 10 stations in one room, you can just go through that room again, except for this time it's the blue room. And the reason why I've, in this example here, put black, blue, green, and red is as an aid to memory, the order of those colors is alphabetized. And in the materials, grass, paper, stone, wood, the order of those materials is alphabetized as with gas, smoke, and water. And the reason for that is alphabetization is an aid to memory. So instead of having like wood and paper and stone and grass, which is out of alphabetical order, and you have to think, well, what came next? You have an actual alphabetized order that helps you remember what comes next. And you don't want to have to think about this too much, so you commit that to memory. And one of the best ways to do that is, of course, use some of these techniques of exaggeration and really putting up the colors. Now, the sort of basically, once you've done this, and this next level is to actually be practicing this and going to not only just thinking about this, but actually trying it, actually taking a memory palace, adding a feature such as a color, and making that whole palace blue. You need to concentrate on that, and so it's an extra challenge, but then turning it into red and concentrating on that. The idea being, when I say making the whole thing, actually focusing on it being the red palace and seeing the walls red, seeing the floor red, seeing the elements inside of it as being red as well. Now, when it comes to cards, you can really get a lot of memory palace versions and memory palace stations inside of them by associating the memory palaces with cards. And what I mean by this is, just like you would have a memory palace that's now made out of grass, the same version made out of wood, or it could be a memory palace with zebra shapes and so forth. You could also have a memory palace that's associated with the ace of spades. Or actually, what you would want to do is start with the ace of clubs, because a great way to memorize the order of the cards, the pips, would be clubs, hearts, spades, and diamonds. And the reason why that's easy to remember is because you can basically construct the word chased out of that. Clubs, hearts, spades, and diamonds. And so, I mean, this is getting into the exponential that I was referring to, when you just can build dozens and dozens of memory palaces versions of itself. But if you had, say, that memory palace that we were showing throughout the presentation, and you had one that was the ace of clubs, and then you had a version that was the two of clubs, and then you had a version that was the three of clubs, and then you got to the king of clubs, then you would revert that station to the ace of hearts, and then move up to the the king of hearts, and then you would go to the ace of spades and up to the king of spades, and then you would go to the next set of cards, and each of those would ultimately lead up to 52 versions of the same memory palace. And if you want to push that even further, you could have the red deck, you could have the blue deck, the green deck, and of course I would recommend putting those into alphabetical order, the colors, as an aid to recall. And this is just a way of really maxing out. And I've spoken with a person who says that he has a memory palace that has 100,000 stations in it. And I think that he means that it has 100,000 stations conceivably, but to what extent that he's actually used 100,000 stations, I don't know. But I think that this is definitely conceivably possible. It's an amazing thing to think about, and it's just a thing to exercise with and play around with. So if you can get to the point where you're just trying it with different colors, then you can move on to trying it with different materials, and then you can move on to trying it with things like substances, and then you can move on to trying it with cards. An extra level of difficulty. And of course, you're memorizing material in these different memory palaces to take it to the next level for yourself. So that's telesynoptic memory palaces. And to go to the next level, I want to talk about memorizing in real time. This is something that people ask me about a lot. They want to know how to be able to go to a lecture and memorize what's going on in the lecture as they're sitting there and being able to recall it. Everything that I've talked about is already in play, so we won't rehearse that. You need to have a memory palace prepared. You need to know that you're going to work on capturing 3 major things, 10 major things, whatever number. I think 10 is probably a pretty good thing, but when you think about it, there's probably fewer major points in your average lecture, but I've had good lecturers where really wanted it all. What I would suggest, however, is that you also make a recording so that you're just paying attention to the lecture and then practice with the recording, and so that you get better at actually being able to do this in real time. And then later you can maybe rely on this more. Because when you're having conversations with people, you can do this, but are you being present with them? Is that an authentic sort of way to interact with people? I don't know. It's really good in a lecture to practice it, but do you want, as a beginner, do you want to miss out what's going on in that lecture, being present to the lecture? I don't know. And even when you can do these things, do you want to miss out on that sort of sense of presence? So what I wanted to share with you is a technology, a website called Come Again. And the Seb Pierce, he actually designed it for people who are learning second languages, and they're using podcasts in their target language. And essentially what you do is you go to this Come Again section of his website, and you see this on your screen. And using the browse button, you go into your computer and you find an MP3 of a foreign language presentation. It doesn't have to be a podcast. It could just be a lecture that you've recorded. And you pop it in there, and then the next screen you get is this. And what this allows you to do is, as you're listening in, so to speak, real time, you can leap back 1 second or up to 4 seconds. And so you're listening, you have a memory palace prepared, you have all the stations prepared, you've decided that you want to remember a certain amount of information, let's say 10 pieces of information, and as you're listening, you practice. And you practice creating real-time associative imagery and placing it along those stations. And if you feel like you need to go back, you can skip back. And you can also, of course, pause the machinery as well. And this is great for practicing learning foreign languages also, because when you're listening to a foreign language and you don't catch all these words, often you find that you can figure out what that word was that you heard if you just can hear it again a couple more times, or even just one more time. But in terms of learning how to memorize in real time, this is a great strategy, is practicing with recorded information first, building your chops, building your skills, and then going and practicing it in real time. And really do it when the stakes are low. So if you want to get into this, and don't go to a lecture where it's really key that you're paying attention and practice this and then lose out on the information. Go to some public lecture that you're not so interested in. It's not part of a test that you have to pass or not part of your research, and just practice with things where you're not under pressure, you're not trying to impress anybody, or you're just experimenting. And that's really how I would suggest learning how to memorize in real time. Keeping in mind the caveat that we have the technology to record things, so you can record things and go and sit and enjoy a lecture and just be present and be there and review later. So that is a really interesting sort of idea, and this can assist you in becoming better at that. And it's a really interesting app, as I said, for also practicing foreign language study and being able to recall very easily words that you've missed and become more familiar with them. So as a little bit of a bonus just for this section, if there's time, I just wanted to briefly go through the application of some of the things that I've been talking about to foreign language study, just very briefly, because I have an entire course on this. I've talked already about the alphabetization of things and how that's a major aid to memory. And it's more than just alphabetizing your memory palaces. It's also about alphabetizing the vocabulary inside of the memory palaces. So what that enables you to do when you're memorizing material inside of memory palaces is use word division as part of incorporating the bridging figures that we've talked about before. Now, this is, I can't get into any specific language or say things that apply to all languages, though I do believe that in different ways it does apply to all languages, is the idea that you can split many words, not all words, there are single syllable words, into 2 or more parts. So that's called word division. And so a typical example, German is very easy because you have a lot of words that start with ein or fair or ab or ser or zu, and you're able to divide them quite cleanly. But it's also true in Spanish with words that start with al, and it's true in English that you can divide these things, although sometimes the English words are end heavy and so forth. But you can divide them, and then you can create bridging figures. So just to use the example of Germany, since we're in a German-speaking country, we have ein can be Einstein as a bridging figure, or App can be Abraham Lincoln. These are sort of favorites of mine. Fair words, VER words, can be my friend Vera, and so forth. And they just go along this journey from word to word. And the alphabetization of these words in the memory palace is an additional aid to memory, not for going out and speaking, but to do this recall rehearsal process that I've been talking about, so these things enter your long-term memory so that you're actually being able to recognize them when you encounter them again. Now, let's say that you're not using a language that's based on the Latinate alphabet, and it's a Cyrillic alphabet, or it's an Asian character system, or anything like that. How do you start to make this word division and bridging character stuff work for you? Well, there's something called the principle of homophonic transliteration. And basically what that means is taking a word from, say, Cyrillic or from a character set and figuring out how you would spell it in English and giving it that sort of form that you can understand, and then splitting it into different word parts and then giving it bridging figures. Now, you want to be able to read that alphabet, and you want to be able to actually memorize things in relation to that alphabet, but just getting started. A lot of people just have the barrier of not finding an in, not finding some quick victories. So if you got into this memory technique stuff, then you can see how to apply it to different languages and then use homophonic transliteration in order to translate the sounds of those words into your own mother tongue and start working with word division and start making word lists. And of course, you want strategies for how you develop those word lists, what words you need to know the most in the quickest order, and order them into memory palaces in different ways that I've talked about in order to get started and get going. So even if it's not a Latinate alphabet, there's ways for you to proceed, and I've given some suggestions here. Now, you want to, of course, and anybody will tell you this, Luca Lamparello, who is a part of this project in terms of us packaging something together, this training with he'll be the first person to tell you that memorizing vocabulary is great, but you need to be reading every day. You need to be listening. You need to be viewing movies. You need to be doing writing activities, and you need to be involving yourself in the target language in a dedicated manner every day. And one of the things that is such a great benefit to memorizing a lot of vocabulary is that when you're doing this stuff, you're not, just absorbing it through repetition and sort of pushing your way through it, but you're actually giving yourself opportunities to bump into those words in ways that create triggers, that create events in your mind, that create sort of experiences where that door opens and opens more and more, and those words that you've memorized and you see them in context, you hear them in context, you begin to magnetize meaning to them, and it just starts coming and building in your brain. But you can memorize all the vocabulary in the world, and it's not going to lead you to fluency if you're not getting into these other activities: speaking, reading, listening, viewing, writing, and as Luca would say, translating as well. And so this is a way into that. If you're struggling, once you've learned these memory techniques, you don't need to struggle so much in terms of memorization. And I started to use this for foreign language learning because I have no real ability to memorize words in the way that Luca talks about. I needed something to help myself, and these were the techniques that I came up with. So I think that I just wanted to add this little bonus on there to see a little bit about how all that I've been talking about applies to language learning. And I told you that I was going to give you some examples about speed and what's possible for other people. And I've been really blessed and honored to have some people starting to write blog posts about the magnetic memory method and their application, application of the method to their studies, particularly to foreign language study. And one of the really great ones that came out is by a guy named Noel Van Vliet, and he says very modestly on the sidebar, I'm not one of those super polyglots. I only speak 3 languages, but I speak them well. He's being self-deprecating and overly modest, but nonetheless, he wanted to take a challenge and really try what I was talking about. He thought it was fascinating. And so what he did is he actually wrote 3 blog posts. I'm just citing one here, which is what he called Judgment Day, the final results. And he literally timed himself throughout the activity. So he talks about the exact number of sessions that he did, and he did 19 sessions of 40 minutes, and he tells exactly how many hours that was. And basically, he said that he learned a new word every 6 minutes, and that's pretty incredible. And then he later tested his recall. I'd like you to visit that website and read the whole article. And basically his recall was something like 1 word per every 6 seconds. He was able to recall words during his testing sequence. And he, to be perfectly clear, he used Spanish, and he has decent Spanish fluency in some levels. So he challenged himself to memorize words that he didn't know before, but very sophisticated words that were really pushing his fluency into a new level. But he did have that grounding already in some basic Spanish. And really, when I designed the magnetic memory method for vocabulary learning, it says on all the books that this will serve you best if you've already struggled a bit with that language or you already had some experience with that. But beginners have been using it as well to get really interesting strides going for themselves. And so it's really for anybody who wants to find traction. But I really like what he reported here. There's 3 articles in total, and he's getting down to actually time trials. And so that's pretty exciting what he was able to achieve. The other thing that I would suggest as reading, inspirational reading and educational reading, because this article is incredible. She actually shares her Excel files that she created. You can download them, and some other files that she created. This is Amanda Markham, and she lives and works in Australia. She works with Aboriginal tribes that speak a particular language that really only 3,000 people in the world speak. And I haven't got the whole article for you here, but you can visit that URL. And she says, the method I'm about to describe allowed me to go from understanding only half of what I was hearing to knowing 70% of what was being said in a very short time. So that's quite an amazing boost. And in 10 days, she did over 200 words that she added to the vocabulary that she uses in her work. So it made her profession, gave her profession a very big boost using this technique. And she goes through the results and has some reflections. And she talks about her challenges that she had. And so I really cite this article to you and gave you that link to go and check it out, because I think that the way that she went through everything is really incredible. She approached it in a different way than I described, and that's the whole point of all this, is that I described a method, and she really took that method and made it her own, and it resembles the basics of what I do, but it's really fascinating to see how someone took it and ran with it and got amazing results. And it would apply to also your studentship if you're working in medicine or in the legal profession and so forth. The same sort of results would happen for you as well. And one of the things that's really neat here is that she talks about how if the image isn't distinct enough, then of course you want to work on compounding it. But one thing she points out is that she never, ever had problems with locations, because she was being very careful about using ones that she's really actually familiar with and structuring them in particular ways. So I wonder if there are any questions about the advanced strategies or the application to language that have come up. But that is this portion of the presentation.